Prior to joining SOAS, Raghavi was a doctoral researcher at the European University Institute in Florence. Her PhD proposed a multimedia and ethnographic rearticulation of cultural rights in international law using Global South epistemologies. To this end, she was engaged in extensive collaborative fieldwork with rulers semi-nomadic community based in southern India. Raghavi holds postgraduate degrees from Leiden Law School and the University of Oxford, where she specialized in international human rights and international criminal law. Raghavi has taught undergraduate and postgraduate courses at the University of Torino, National Law School India, the University of Salamanca, La Sapienza University Ashoka, and the University of East London, and doubles as a careers moot court mentor in several academic institutions. Raghavi's interests in academic and policing extend to issues of epistemic injustice, sensory approaches to law, hate crimes, and cultural heritage law. He has been a consultant for cultural rights, collectives, ministries in India, Italy, and Kenya, a research fellow at the Global Citizenship Observatory, and a senior research associate at Public International Law and Policy Group. Presently, she is a member of the ICOMOS Working Group on Rights-Based. Claire Smith is a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. She is an editor of Emancipating International.
No sound.
There you go. I can hear you, Raghavi.
You can hear us now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, great. All right. In which case, Claire, let's start with you. Preliminarily, I think something for us to say is that this is this is a nascent idea, and we're so glad that we got the opportunity to sort of workshop it with all of you here. And Claire will sort of speak about where the idea came from, which is really her mind, and take you through, where we are at in terms of building this collective, and we'll take it from there. Claire, over to you.
Thank you. So first, an apology that I'm not there in the room with everyone. It was my intention to be there. How with everything? Can you hear me?
Yes. Can we make Claire's sound volume higher?
Good to go?
Okay, Claire, do you want to speak now?
Is that better?
Continue speaking, maybe.
Okay. I'll just keep going until I'm told to stop. So the
Yeah,
first.
I think it is better.
Okay. The first thing is an apology. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there. I was meant to be there in the room with you, and I was meant to fly through Doha, so obviously that just wasn't possible this week. The second thing is, as Raghavi said, these are very preliminary ideas. We're so excited to be able to talk to you guys about them. I can't actually see the room, so Raghavi's going to have to be my eyes. And yeah, this will be quite an interactive session. So we're very excited about everyone's participation. Raghavi would be too humble to tell you that she's been giving lectures in Nairobi this week, and every time she's done that, she's come back and said the students are phenomenal, and we've also been talking to your lecturers, and the words that they use are extraordinary and excellent students. So that's what we are hoping, lots of participation. I'm not sure if you guys can see my slides, so I'll just give you a rundown of the agenda as well. So there's kind of the next couple of hours will be broken down into 4 sessions. We've built in lots of breaks, so each should run for about 40 minutes. So the first one is kind of a conceptual session, so you understand more about the project, the kind of thematic understandings that are required. The second session will be kind of putting all of that, the conceptual apparatus, into practice. So we've got some prompts to do some group work. The third session is your associate dean is going to come and kind of reflect on the themes coming out of the sessions in his own work. And then the last session will be a conclusion, and hopefully you guys will be willing to give us some feedback. So just to speak really briefly about how we came to abolishing international law. So for the last 4 years, I've been working on a book which is about race and international law. And as part of that, kind of trying to understand the role that race plays, but also trying to understand whether the structural embeddedness of race in international law is so deep that the racism and racialization that evolves from that can't be remedied. And as part of that, and then obviously during that time period, COVID-19 hit. There was the uprisings in relation to the police killing of George Floyd in America, and kind of the interactions between race and the international law system were brought to the front. And as part of that, obviously, abolitionist thinking, abolish the police, is something that was a turn of phrase throughout that process. And so as part of the book, we held a series of workshops reflecting on these themes, and a very, very senior, very well-respected academic was joking, abolish the police, abolish international law. He, of course, was joking, but I obviously took that more seriously. And so part of this process has been reflecting on what abolition could do for international law, specifically thinking through the processes of trying to make international law better, but also reading in the outside into international law and the troubles that kind of creates. Raghavi, do you want to reflect on how you came to the project yourself?
Sure. I hope you will appreciate that this is a little difficult given that one of us is in. And Claire and I were often joking just before this session that this is also very much a product of Eurocentric international law, right? The fact that she can't come, and the fact that we are caught in this kind of really polarized world where we're trying to have conversations about abolition, but we seemingly cannot abolish the reality of our conditions. So Claire spoke to you about her book and where ideas of abolition germinated for her. And really for me, in parallel, I think from 2020 is when I started my PhD. And when I started my PhD, I was frankly mainly trained in doctrinal legal methods. I had been trained in India. And as a post-colonial country, we have very successfully, I want to say, internalized colonial legal pedagogy. And that meant that I was really underexposed to critical legal thought for a long time. When I started my PhD in 2020, I partnered with a semi-nomadic community in India. They're called the Irulars. And through my work with the Irulars, I was basically trying to understand what would international law on cultural rights look like if this semi-nomadic community were to make it, right? What is the form that they would use? How would they define culture and justice and rights? And can we ever imagine a world where international law and international legal institutions are kind of refashioned to foreground these kinds of ways of thinking about law, like the Irulars' ways of thinking about law? That was the project. And really the year I started working with the Irulers, 2021, was a really important kind of temporal milestone for them, because a movie was released about them, an Indian language movie about the Irulers, and it told a story about custodial violence. Okay, it told a story about an Irular man who succumbed to custodial violence and passed away, and his wife turned to the legal system, and she decided to basically avenge his unlawful killing by the state, by the structure, right? And because of this movie, the Irulers were kind of placed in a rather paradoxical situation. On the one hand, lots of civil society were rushing towards them and speaking about their story, telling them, use rights language, use rights language. On the other hand, because this movie was about custodial violence, their everyday reality actually became more hostile. The police became more hostile towards them. And in that moment, this community decided to turn to international law, right? They found international law as a potential kind of new strategy, a new strategy using which they could signify themselves, using which they could, see if there are possibilities for emancipation. And that I found really interesting, because I was going to the rulers after years of training, thinking about international law as a supranational thing, not thinking about international law as a legal project that has often excluded and perhaps will only know how to exclude communities like them. But when I spoke to them, I realized there was a lot of hope in them. Hope not just because international law represented some kind of normative ideal, but hope because it represented a new kind of strategic vocabulary for them. Right. So when I met Claire through the course of this book that she was editing, and I had the opportunity also to contribute a chapter to the book. As Claire was saying, I was rather surprisingly coming to this conversation about international law, hearing, sort of piggybacking on what my collaborators were telling me. I was coming to it from a place of hope. Right. And the question that I was mainly sort of grappling with was, you know, sure, international law needs work, right? Its design is he has historically been stacked against people who have not been close to centers of power. That's for sure. But if we are to think about changing international law as we know it, what does it take? Does it mean we make international law more elastic, like we create room in what we know for the new, or we build up from scratch, right? Like what are the various routes through which we could build a new? I think those were the kinds of questions that I was sort of sitting with when I met Claire. And given all the thinking she had done about abolition, it was really a case of both of us deciding to think together. And I must say, all the conversations we have just become really long, philosophical, kind of angry, hopeful, but really completely kind of emotional reflections on what international law could be for people like us, but actually more so for people in the global majority, right? And I think that is really where the project kind of originates from. Claire, would you like to take us to the next part of the conversation?
Of course. And I think that the reflex between hope and ultimately depression kind of captures our understanding of what abolition is as a concept, right? So that embodies the abolitionist praxis, which we're trying to bring forward through not only the way in which we see the project, but how we actually do the project. So within abolition, just the very idea of abolishing, is to tear down. It's to understand that something isn't working, to tear down. But equally within abolitionist practice, it's all about figuring out whether you replace, whether you rebuild, whether you renew, and how you do that ultimately. So conceptually and in praxis, that's where we sit. And at the same time, as Raghavi has kind of pointed out, this work is already happening. This idea of the rebuilding or the renewing or the re-understanding or reimagining or even working against or rejecting is already occurring. And I think there's parts of the abolitionist canon in the sense of the specific prison abolition movement, which obviously plays a huge part in understanding and conceptualizing what abolition is. So stemming out of the American experience and the direct relationship with slavery and the work that that does. But there are really strong moments of intersection with international law. So Angela Davis, who is a pioneer of the prison abolitionist movement, she speaks very strongly about the Beijing Women Conference. Other very long-standing members of abolition communities, they talk about, they work.
Claire, I think network is a little unstable.
Okay. Do you want to take over?
It's Claire's.
It's mine?
We lost you for the last 30 seconds, I want to say, maybe a little bit more.
Where did I get up to?
You said prison abolition.
Okay.
Angela Davis.
Angela Davis, a great place to be cut off. Angela Davis talks about, her experience at the women's conferences in the 1990s, and there's other abolitionist experiences at the Durban Conference, which then was the precursor to the Convention on Racism. So there are these strong moments of intersection with international law. And then obviously in international law's history, there's a lot of abolitionist thoughts, whether it's from the abolition of slavery as kind of this generative moment of a very Western understanding of international law's history, or the failure to abolish nuclear. Do you want
cutting out again?
Do you want to swap in, Raghavi?
Sure. All right. Just as Claire was saying, abolitionist thought has typically had different trajectories, and those trajectories have not always intersected, right? So abolitionist thought has often been kind of associated with the prison abolition movement in the US, but it has also had a very long genealogy in international law. And international law and abolitionist thought have not always kind of spoken back to the efforts taking place within the prison abolition movement. And often the conversation about abolition has centered on the idea of insecurity, right? How can we imagine a world with no prisons? What would that mean for the rest of society? It's always been a case of, as a sovereign, our responsibilities are to ensure security, ensure prosperity, economic development. Abolition was always seen as a kind of world building that would negate these so-called responsibilities of the Euro-colonial, Euro-modern state, right? So, and that's perhaps why a lot of the abolitionist work that was taking place within domestic arenas was not being connected to international law. And really, when we started thinking about this abolitionist project, one of the questions we were asking ourselves, which is something we continue to do, is to think about why we should have conversations about abolition now, and why should we have conversations about abolition here, right? So let me try and explain what our sort of broad perspectives are on both of these issues. Today, we live in a world where every single day, our popular media, our day-to-day news is completely kind of inundated by references to international law. Right? Think about where we were even 10 years ago. International law at that time was at least presented as a far more removed kind of concern from all of our everyday lives. But today we live in a world where we have no position, no option but to take a position on international law, right? Like we live in a world where every single day we are realizing that we're having encounters with international law, whether it is, Claire not being able to take a flight to come here, or whether it is needing a vaccine, whether it is realizing that the tariffs you're paying have shot up, right? Like every single ordinary everyday encounter has become mediated by international law, which was not really the case before, right? Before there was this kind of sense that international law is a distant project. States will make international law, right? Like it's not something within our provenance. We don't need to worry. Someone else is making international law for us, but we are no longer left in that position, right? We can't avoid international law anymore. But on the other hand, what's also been happening is that just as states have historically made international law, they continue to make and break international law. Previously, they were a little more, I want to say, covert about the ways they would do it, right? Like today, we're talking about Trumpian international law, right? Like what is the qualifier Trumpian really doing? It's telling you that the same kind of strategies that composed and decomposed neoliberal international law that were unknown to us before, they're all really clear now, right? Like no one is using the pretense anymore that international law is what gives them power, international law is what gives them the authority to create hierarchies, to civilize people, to classify certain people as racialized and primitive, as incapable of deciding for themselves, right? So, really, for us, the reason why this moment was particularly important was because of the collision of both of these phenomena. That, on the one hand, as everyday people, international law has become something we must be concerned about. And on the other hand, all the rules, all the kind of invisible colleges, invisible rules of international law, as we had only otherwise read about, were being played out in front of us on a day-to-day basis, right? So, really, that was the kind of moment that we wanted to tap into. And just as Claire said when she began, we live in a world where every day people are saying international law is dead, right? International law is constantly being proclaimed to be dead. But by calling it dead, we are resurrecting it again and again, right? By calling this law dead, we are making it relevant. We are revalorizing it, right? And that's the irony that we wanted our work to sort of situate itself in. That here is a discipline that is apparently got no value, but we constantly sing the song of it having no value and attach more and more value to it, right? Why is it that we are doing that? And the second part of the question was, as Claire was saying, why should we have this conversation here, right? What do we mean by here? By here, we really just mean the global majority. Historically, all decisions about what international law should look like, what international law should or should not do, these decisions have taken place in hallowed rooms in The Hague or Geneva or in New York. But the truth is that international legal encounters and world building exercises have always been kind of erected in the global majority, right? You think about abolitionist praxis, the subaltern traditions have always flourished. They've been the kind of pioneers of abolitionist praxis. So we wanted to stage this conversation about abolition in international law also in the global majority. And I think something to say here is in doing so, we wanted to recognize that the global majority is not free of domination or hierarchy itself, right? Think about this university. Now, Claire and I have had a rather recent tryst with the university, but those of you who are associated with the university will know of its complicated history, right? It's complicated history in terms of ownership, in terms of political associations, and how there are clashes, right? You have progressive thought, but you also have troubled political baggage. You can have a university that's in the global majority that enjoys a lot of privilege, right? You can have a rich kind of upper middle class university in the global south, as they call it, which is going to be producing very different thought, which is going to have very different opportunities to produce thought compared to a rural university, right? So we wanted to kind of bust the myth that international legal thought is produced only by units, kind of homogeneous units. And that's why I think the space where we have these conversations was really kind of important to us. Claire, do you want to jump in here?
Yes. So I feel like the final piece of the puzzle is kind of an understanding of what we mean by this idea of carcerality. So obviously the intersections between the prison abolition movement, which we've talked about, obviously there's a very specific notion of abolition as abolishing prisons and the forms of containment that requires. So I think the crux of our kind of theoretical framework when we talk about abolitionist international law is understanding the idea of the containment that international law requires of us, which extend beyond the prison. So this idea that carceralities are the conditions or the set of social arrangements that advances a reliance on punishment, surveillance, or incapacitation, which includes ideological, political, legal, and public investment in deploying apparatuses of control. So that was on a slide. I'm very sorry. Hence the only time I will really like read out anything specifically. And so as Raghavi was talking about, this increased everyday encounter of many people with international law many times in their day-to-day life is indicative of this kind of like carceral creep in international law. So this idea that international law increasingly contains us in various ways, whether that's through like the transformation of space, public institutions, cities, states into carceral and locations of containment. And part and parcel of that is this idea that certain populations are marginalized through racialization, gender, able-bodiedness, and therefore policed, dispossessed, or subject to some kind of gaze of power. So this idea of how does international law contain us through our increasing interactions with it.
So Claire told you about carcerality, right? Just now, carcerality is the idea of being contained. It's a social relation which really travels out of the prison. You see it in your everyday spaces, you see it in surveillance, you see it in bordering practices, you see it in the kinds of languages available to you to define yourself, right? So carcerality is really a kind of quality of international law in contemporary times. And maybe just to start a little bit of a conversation about this, I know lots of you are familiar with all of these kind of historical events. But if I were to ask you, regardless of how familiar or not familiar you are with carcerality, what would be, if at all, any, the connections between or the similarities between the abolition of slavery and nuclear disarmament? Like, what do you think connects abolition of slavery and nuclear disarmament? Can we sort of solicit some thoughts from the group? So we know of both events, right? Both really kind of important milestones in international law, sometimes not even. But important milestones in international law, abolition of slavery, nuclear disarmament. What do you think really connects these two? Yeah, let's pass the mic around. Or if people want to come onto stage and speak, maybe Claire will also get a chance to see you.
But also you don't have to, because that's quite intense. So I understand if you just I can hear you're disembodied.
No, it's okay. I'm here on the podium alone. Someone can join me. Okay, great. Elvis here.
Hi, everyone. So my idea is if abolition of slavery was end of carcerality, in that sense, slavery and servitude, where people were in plantations and all of that, and then nuclear, like to non-proliferation, really is also another form of. And here, understanding carcerality outside the prison, so it's they are both instances of challenging against the carcerality of we don't want to be killed by nuclear weapons, especially because the post-colonial states most of them do not have the power to make their own nuclear weapons. Yeah, again, very, I think, foundational or like basic, but that's how I'm understanding it. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Elvis just said, look, abolition of slavery was also an attempt to push back against carcerality, as was nuclear non-proliferation, right? Non-proliferation was also a case of post-colonial states often standing up and saying, we don't want to buy into this system. We don't want to buy into this carceral system, right? Where do we go from here? Other thoughts?
Yeah, so,
Sorry, I'm making you do this, but come to the podium. Claire will like it.
I really want to see everyone's faces, so thank you so much.
okay, so these are just my personal thoughts. For me, I'm Nabintu, first of all, from
Hi.
the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC.
Okay.
And the connection that I see, like for me, is nuclear weapons. I know there are some of Congolese minerals that were used to produce the weapon, the uranium. And which means the first devastating impact of it started like in Congo. And there is like, you can see the impacts today. Then also on the other hand, we see slavery. I remember like even from history in class, there are many Congolese who are forcibly like taken away from their families, lands, and all that. So in both like instance, I see loss of life, loss of culture, loss of like natural resources. Like, okay, in this we see labor like that is taken for like extraction and all that. So those are like the connections. And when I see abolition of slavery, again, I'm like, yes, I could say like at that time, a lot of human rights questions like, wow, like taking place and all that. But we all know that slavery like ended because it was no longer profitable in that way. It became like,
Excellent point.
yeah. So in that sense, so for me, I'm like, okay, then on the other side, nuclear weapons right now, I'm not sure abolishing it even like something that we can do. Thinking about it is really like, for me, like, it's, for it to happen is really doing for many. And yeah, it's really difficult to see.
Yeah. No, but
Yeah.
you have seen very effectively, actually.
Yeah.
More thoughts. Do you have more thoughts from the room? Yes, please. Come on up.
I speak from here?
Yeah, I think it's okay for me. Claire, is it okay for her?
Yeah,
to speak
I
from-
can see you. I can see you. Thank you so much.
If you hit flip, she'll be able to see there.
So, my understanding of the question is first, when tracing the history of the abolitionist movements or something of a sort, I realized that it went from slavery and then it's what inspired the look onto human rights in the 20th century, the early 20th century. So while slavery was one of the first, or rather one of the most prominent outlooks that highlight, okay, or rather things that highlighted the economic inequality or exploitation of one part of the world, and that's the global south, nuclear weapons more than anything highlight the structural inequalities between the global north and the global south. So even after the development of, because it was first after the development of human rights, and then we find the nuclear weapon treaty on the same, that it was much more of a push to ensure that whatever structural inequalities that will come from the imbalance or the asymmetry of powers between those
Hello.
Yeah, you've come back. I lost you.
Okay. You lost us briefly.
Okay, I think
Nope.
try now.
Can you hear us and see us okay?
I can hear and see you now.
Okay, great. I have a feeling I'm still experiencing some lag, but we had some really interesting kind of thoughts aired here. About one way of looking at it, which could be that both abolition of slavery and nuclear non-proliferation were cases of people pushing back against carceral systems. But as we heard from the others, there are also other ways of looking at it, which are that slavery, like someone said, the abolition of slavery was sort of motivated by the fact that it was no longer profitable, right? What else is happening there is one way of looking at it is also to think about this idea of carcerality and how it works when it produces identity categories. Okay, the reason I say this is because this is a conversation Claire and I often have. When you think about abolition of slavery, What also ended up happening because of that moment was a kind of legitimization of the way that law signifies certain identities, right? So when you kind of co-opt into that identity, you co-opt also into the carceral effects of law when it creates those identities, right? You reify blackness as an identity, you reify gender as an identity, and in doing that, you only sort of give effect to the terms that the law prescribe to it, right? So sometimes what could also happen is that carcerality could contain, like international law could contain, even if it makes you think that you're emancipating yourself, sometimes international law through the emancipation can also contain, right? So a conversation we wanted to start when we asked this question was to sort of reflect on the successes, this international law successes. In abolition of slavery in many renditions of international law or legal history will be proclaimed as a success, right? But to peel back beyond that rhetoric of success and think about, what were the real reasons? Did we really replace empire with a global majority system, or did we replace empire with another empire, right? Like, think about, was it just circulation of power, or was it the creation of a new world order that was actually anti-carceral, right? So these are some of the conversations we wanted you to start having when we were speaking about, if at all you were to connect slavery, the abolition of slavery and nuclear disarmament, what would be your connecting registers? What would be the connecting threads? Claire, do you want to pitch in here?
No, I think also the other thing that came through in the answers that I heard was the demands of international law in terms of the staticism and its understandings of temporality and geography. So the conversation about labor conditions and extractive in extractive industries now, and those relationships and the continuities between slavery and nuclear proliferation. There's so many different ways of thinking about this, and all of them require or demand some type of containment or confinement. And I think part of the joy of abolition is the historical interconnections between those in situations that international law tends to make disparate. So the strict separation and abolition allows us to connect those things and continuities and reflect on them. And I think that's really important. So shall we throw the microphone out and ask if anyone wants to kind of think about specifically Kenyan examples or examples from their own life that they can see carcerality manifesting?
Yep. Let me repeat that question. So if we were to ask you, now that we've had a little bit of interaction with the concept of carcerality, right, and how international law has utilized it, if you were to look at these concepts closer home, okay, in the Kenyan context, what you know of Kenyan encounters with international law, what are the incidents that would come to your mind? Incidents that show this carcerality at work. What do people think? Take some time. Take some time. This is really not a question that needs an immediate response. So Kenya's relationship or Kenya's sort of complicity in international legal carcerality, what would your responses be? Humphreys here?
Or DRC or Nigeria. Because then Congolese and Nigerian students.
Mr. Home.
Yes, we can think, African international law and carcerality. We can think Kenya and international legal carcerality. Think along all of these lines. What are the examples that would come to your mind? And let's all do like a round robin of sorts.
Just start again.
Yes, please. Elvis always the one to shoulder the burden of being the first person to speak.
Yeah, so the one thing that comes to my mind is like sovereign debt and conditionalities, like basically the interaction between international financial institutions and Kenya or all other African countries.
Harrison will be very happy with this response, I think.
Yeah, so I guess it is a form of carcerality that we are bonded by this debt that we have to pay. And it seems that we are not finding sustainable solutions of like either paying all of that and not taking more debt, and even the origin of the debt itself. Like I think people like Usha Natarajan have over Sukinese who've written on odious debt and its connection with reparations itself. So I guess, yeah, that is my answer. Carcerality through sovereign debt.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Carcerality through sovereign debt. I think we already have a great list to start off with. Others? You know, we could also, just as you're thinking about it, right? Think about it also on an everyday encounter level, right? The conversation we've been having so far is that international legal encounters are not just encounters that take place on the supranational level. We are encountering as individuals, we also encounter international law every day. So what are the carceralities we experience on the everyday also, right? Like, think about the very proximate circumstances to, you know, you move up from there. Other examples? Yep. After this, I'm going to sort of press on people who have not spoken to also speak. Yep.
Okay, the example that the thought that first came to mind when thinking of carcerality was, I thought we interacted in an earlier class talking about containerization of natives. And that was literally tied to colonialism, what was done in Africa. It's a thought from Citizen and Subject from the book by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani.
Yeah.
And when I think about how it has played out, then carcerality will be manifested in every colonial legal system or every other inherited colonial system, and how it has actually played out. And looking specifically at the legal system, Professor Mbani in one of his papers says that we've had political independence without judicial independence. And because carcerality is about looking at how we're having punitive or other systems which focus much more on punishment more than anything. And so the other counter movement we've had to that is the introduction of multiple justice systems within the the judiciary in Kenya to sort of reintroduce the alternative dispute resolution methods that were used in our traditional societies to solve issues instead of just the normal or rather the formal legal systems that were basically, again, an inherited system.
Yeah. Excellent answer. I think this is a conversation also that we've been having, Claire and I, that the kind of inheritances, right? Colonial borders, inheriting colonial borders, colonial judicial systems, that is a lasting, continuing form of carcerality. But I want to press you on that. And the reason I say this is because oftentimes the replacement of the colonial with post-colonial, say like an alternative justice system, is ipso facto seen as a good thing, right? But sometimes what we don't do is to reflect critically on what are the internalized statecrafts within that alternative justice system, right? Who's getting to speak? Do women and children get to participate equally, right? Are those justice systems really modeled on kind of emancipatory, egalitarian norms, or are they just old norms in different clothes? Right, like those kinds of, simply because it is an overt transfer of hands from the colonial to the post-colonial, which appears to be a departure from an inheritance, right? That visible departure sometimes stops us from really questioning whether you see that departure translating in the replacement of norms, in the replacement of participation. This is the conversation that often happens when we say, what's the difference between diversity and decolonizing, right? Diversity is what? It's, oh, I have this podium. This podium is going to remain the same, but instead of 3 white people standing around this podium, it'll be 2 brown people and 2 black people, right? But is that really enough? No. What are we doing? We're speaking the same language. We're speaking the same language spoken in centers of power. Decolonizing requires me to throw this table down and build a new table, right? That's when my norms change. That's when my foundation changes, right? And I guess something to say, Claire, please chip in here, is that as we speak about abolition, I think we must also recognize that abolition can take place in various forms to various degrees, right? We don't want to put the burden of kind of replacing or completely rejigging on the global majority. Sometimes abolition is a combination of what was old with what is new. Sometimes it is a completely new world, right? So recognizing that abolition can take place in various ways is important, I think, for the future of the abolitionist project itself. Claire, do you want to say something here?
So two things came to mind.
I see you're shaking, not.
No. Two things came to mind. So I'm a New Zealander, and we have alternative forms of justice, particularly for youth offenders, in our Indigenous society. And one of the really interesting things that has always struck me is that occurs and is obviously like it is a beneficial thing, but things that come into play which operate within kind of the carceral framework is the evidentiary rules stay the same, which I always find really fascinating. So there's like very specific maintenance of the ways in which structures of powers are maintained and the maintenance of the status quo, even within these, objectively positive moves to create some form of justice system that's more reflective of the society from which it now has to work within. And the second thing is on the idea of leaving some things in place and rebuilding other things. And I think this is the thing that I find most helpful about an abolitionist framework is this is a process, right? Like if we actually think of a world in which international law can be different or will have a different result, that's not we decide, or Donald Trump tomorrow decides that international law is irrelevant and he gets to do whatever he wants, or we get to do different things. This is how do we start to begin to create a society where the social relations that law regulates are fundamentally different. And what does that mean? Not only in our everyday life, but in the way in which we expect international law to operate, if we expect that at all.
Yeah, just related to that, I often offer this vignette when I speak about kind of my engagement with critical international law, and it's a vignette from my fieldwork, right? So, like I said at the start, I work with nomadic communities from India. Now, nomadic communities are very clear whenever someone speaks to them, they'll tell you we don't identify as indigenous, right? Because our relationship with land is very different. We are transient. We are tenants on a land. We live on a land for 4 days, 5 days, and then we move. And that's very different from how an indigenous person would define their relationship with land. They would say, we have an ancestral relationship with land, right? So think about nomadic communities in India who have suffered, who have been victimized by colonialism. You have the post-colonial state come in. The post-colonial state brings in developmental rhetoric, developmental violence. So that's also something that they sort of grapple with. And then in contemporary times, this nomadic community, like many others, is stuck in a really kind of tense position, right? So on the one hand, civil society, local civil society, even the state will expect them to oppose developmentalism in the same way as an indigenous community, because they know that these are communities who live on public land. They're one of the first to be evicted, right? So if the development project is coming up, the Indian state will often say, even like local civil society will say to them, come on, protest with us. Show your opposition vocally, loudly. You have to commit to an equal protest as an indigenous person. And these nomadic communities will say to them, but we are not the same. Like, we are actually very different from indigenous communities. Why are you expecting us to protest in the same way? On the other hand, indigenous communities tell these nomadic communities, you are ecological parasites. You don't even know how to take care of the environment in the same way as we do. Right? So here you have a case of a community that's at the same time sort of receiving carceral logics from the state, receiving carceral logics from the police, from local civil society that has internalized that carcerality, also from indigenous peoples who have internalized that carcerality. And any opportunity this nomadic community gets to, show that it is more powerful than a kind of caste oppressed community, they will use that logic, right? So you have what I'm trying to illustrate here is that at the same time, you can have communities that oppose carcerality in some ways, but also buy into carcerality in other ways, which doesn't really mean that they're not engaged in abolitionist work. It is abolitionist work, but all I'm trying to say is that the burden of doing abolition right is not a burden we need to impose on everyone. Because the more we impose that burden, the more we kind of disenfranchise the full extent of what abolitionist praxis should mean and really does mean in the global majority. Right. So maybe, Claire, this is a good time to kind of segue into our second session.
I was going to say we are right on time.
Great. So basically what we have done now is we have come up with prompts. Okay, we'd like this group to help me here. I'm not the best at math, but we'd like all of you to sort of band together in groups of, say, 8 or 10. Yeah, can we do that? Can we all stand up and kind of huddle together or huddle into groups? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you prompts. Okay, these are all prompts based on international legal encounters that you would have read about, you would have studied. Okay, but this time we want you to revisit those international legal episodes and point out the carcerality. Okay, so let's first regroup ourselves, if we can do that. Stand up, stretch your legs.
Raghavi, I'm just very conscious that we've got quite a few people online, so we should say that this isn't going to be reflected on screen. So this is an in-person exercise, and so
there's a big group online.
Yeah, so I would say it's going to take about 45 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah, and then for the third session is Harrison's going to talk about how carcerality, the interrelationship between his work on international economic law and carcerality works in his thoughts. So that will be in about an hour, right?
So all right. Can we, I see a lot of movement. I'm going to do some housekeeping now. Humphrey has now been given a bunch of sheets. Each sheet has an example. Okay, it has a prompt. And we are going to do this exercise for, say, 45 minutes. Is that right, Claire?
Yeah, I would say 40 minutes and then a 5-minute break. So I think everyone might need a break at that point.
30, aim for 30. Get into your groups, okay, and look at the prompt closely. And we would like you to kind of reflect on 3 questions. Claire, would you like to sort of read out the questions and I can go to the groups?
Yes. So the first is, can you spot the carceralities in each of these episodes in international law? So 1, find the carcerality. 2, what are the categories through which this carcerality manifests? So how does the carcerality play out? Then we'd love you to think about what would international law look like without these carceral moments, and could you make international law different or to achieve a better outcome? So what's the carcerality? How does it work? Can you imagine international law without this carceral moment? And if not, could you make it different to achieve a better outcome? Whatever you think that might be.
Great. Can we have a show of hands? Does everyone have a prompt for their group? Is there anyone who doesn't have a prompt? Can you raise your hands? I see people at the back don't have prompts yet. Please do make this a group exercise, okay? We don't want you to do this alone. Claire, the auditorium is looking very different from how it was looking 5 minutes ago.
That's the point, right? Is that everyone's moving around, chatting, talking.
Okay, you guys have a prompt? Okay, do you have a prompt? Yeah? Okay. Okay, can we do another show of hands? I see that people are mostly settled. Is there any group without a prompt? Okay, so everyone has prompts. Let me then kind of repeat the questions that we had set out. Okay, so there are 3 questions. We wanted to spend 10 minutes on each question. Okay? Is everyone here? Everyone sort of focused on the questions?
Just read out the question.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. Great. Thank you, Elvis. You are a co-teacher in this session. Excellent. Great. Prompts. Claire, maybe we could just put in the link to the prompts also in the chat.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are in the room, I'm just repeating, we are trying to get you to think about 3 questions, okay? Each question for about 10 minutes, and I'll come and sort of be noisy and tell you 10 minutes are up. Okay, first question, can you spot the carcerality in the episode that you have chosen? Okay, in the prompt given to you, can you kind of trace how carcerality is at play? Second, if it is at play, what are the legal categories it's using? Okay, so what are the devices it's using? Third, what would happen if you were to imagine an international law that was done differently? So, an international law that didn't use this carceral episode or carceral tool. Okay, so first is a question of spotting, spot the carcerality. Second, identify exactly how it's working. Third, so which category it's using. Third, think about what international law would look like if this hadn't happened or if this had happened differently. Okay, now as you work on your, what we'd like you to do is to take down a couple of notes that would allow your group to make a 5-minute presentation at the end. Okay, so each group is going to have to come back. I see loud sighs. I'm sorry I revealed this at the very end. I should have done this before. Yeah, so but right time, I hope. So work on a 5-minute presentation that would basically summarize the takeaways of your reflections on all 3 questions. Okay, and each group will get the chance to present at in the 4th session.
Yeah. What's going on?
Get unmuted.
Blood.
Oh God. Ni nyingi sasa tumefanya mbaya leo. Like why is everything so What is this?
Can you spot carcerality? Second, if you can spot carcerality, how is it working? What is the legal categories it's using? Is it race? Is it gender? Is it motherhood? Is it space? What is the legal category it's using? Third, if you were to imagine a world without Nuremberg trial, okay, an international law where Nuremberg trial didn't happen or it happened differently, what would it look like? Okay, can you imagine a differently done international law without or just a modified version of what you saw in your prompt? Okay. And we would like every group to identify one or maybe two rapporteurs, okay, people who will come and summarize just for 2 to 3 minutes. Tell us what your group discussed about all of these questions in whatever order. That's on you. I see Humphreys with one group, so they have a big advantage. Maybe we should give them more questions to answer, just to ensure equality. This is epistemic injustice, exactly. Fine. Okay, I think we have about 10-ish minutes left. Okay, so think about what your group wants to say. And if you have any questions about this, you may want to carry forward some of that questions and address them to Harrison, who is going to do a guest presentation shortly after this. Right? So think about reflections, especially insofar as they concern economic law, trade, investment. You'll see that these are actually issues that intersect with lots of the prompts that we have given you. Think about questions that come up, ask him, and then you make your presentation at the last session. Maybe we should do a Russian roulette of sorts where each group comes to the stage and discusses here for a bit so that Claire can see you.
I mean, I would love that, but it does feel a bit mean.
But you know that camera that they have there, it might be able to pan a little bit to the left or right, can it?
I've got quite a wide view at the moment, so which is helping because I can see some students discussing.
Okay, that's good. Good. I see new people have just joined. Kind of absorb yourself in one of the groups, please. Okay, let's do this for 5 more minutes, yeah? 5 closing minutes, and then we'll take a short break, and then we'll have Harrison's session. Are you going by okay? Making progress? Fine, okay, good. Make sure you select the rapporteur. Okay, they're going to have to make a presentation at the end. We want you guys to be able to say what you've said about it. Okay, couple more minutes. I hope you're all wrapping up. Okay. I didn't get it. Do it. What's on? Huh? Okay. I hope these decisions not being this. Which prompt did you do? So they were doing everything, no? Okay. What's your name? Take loudly. And let's start. Oh, okay. So in sports session, I'll call on you and you can present it. All but one. Please move to the thing. Okay.
The Kabrak University Press for organizing this. I want to reflect generally on one, how this project sort of fits into my lived realities, and to start by an anecdote. When I was an undergraduate student, the two most important political figures in our country had been charged for very serious crimes at the International Criminal Court. And I was writing a dissertation on whether, generally, this has become an old type question now, whether the International Criminal Court is targeting Africa. The views that I'd had here in the country were that it can't be so, because most of the referrals are then done by African states anyway, and even the Kenyan one had been sort of approved through parliament, and therefore it can't be that the ICC is targeting Africa. So when I did the research and completed the research, I concluded that the ICC is targeting Africa. And my supervisor, who's a great friend now, said, I mean, that's what research is for. I'm happy with your conclusion. Then I did an interview with the Nuremberg Academy, if I'm not wrong. I was very passionate about this idea that the ICC is targeting Africa. And I remember the question that I was asked is, what does Nuremberg mean for you? By then, I'd not been to Nuremberg. So in my head, I was like, I know the Nuremberg trials. I see the Nuremberg trials. I see the ICC as the inheritor of the Nuremberg trials. And my first answer is Victor's Justice. And as you can guess, I never got that scholarship because it was a scholarship interview. And every time I tell this story, my friends tell me, how naive were you to say such things? And it seems there were very radical things to say at that particular point, because I also said it in class some time back, that while the offenses that our heads of state then and the deputy president had been charged with were very serious, the institution that they have gone through is an imperial institution that is targeting Africans as a whole. And that was not a view that was taken very lightly in my class then. And I just thought, these guys have not done my research. They have not read what I've read, and I left it at that. And I started getting convinced then that people do not understand international law, at least the way I understand it. And there are no people out here who understand international law the way I understand it at that point. So I was getting very disillusioned with international law. So when I went for my master's, long story short, I met Professor James Gathi, who is a big player in third world approaches to international law. And his classes, I have to confess, are not necessarily very critical. In fact, I think they are quite mainstream in a sense. And it is only after I started reading his work that I said, okay, but why doesn't he say all these things that I find really interesting, that I find really, inspiring in his classes? And I asked him, and then he said, actually, there's a whole movement, there are whole people, we are connected, there's a network of people, I can introduce you to so and so. These people are individuals that I went through campus with, and yeah, that's how I got introduced to TWIL. And then these ideas that I was thinking of are not very strange to say in critical circles or in TWIL circles anyway. And that's how I have become, in a sense, a crit in international law. And when I meet fellow crits, it rubs off very quickly. When I saw this project, I knew exactly that this is a project I would love. I mean, I didn't even have to think twice about it. And I was very happy that, Claire, you're doing it, because I know already with the project that we are doing, the book project that is to come out soon, that this will be great. So that's the background. For this project, when Mohsen Alata, who is another star that I really like his work, like his thinking, like his way of doing things, invited me, I was deep in the doldrums of doing my PhD. So I told him, it's attractive, I really want to do it. And for anyone who's doing any kind of writing now, even an undergraduate dissertation, everything else that is out there that is not your PhD is normally more interesting than the PhD. And you want to do everything that is not your PhD or what you're writing on at the moment. And there are all kinds of attractions that normally come through. So I said, this is a distraction. I told Mohsen, this is a distraction. Please allow me to finish my PhD. He said, no, do it. We will support. Don't worry. Everything will be okay. But because it was a really good project, I decided to do it. So again, I'm coming with a strong baggage here. I'm coming with a very strong third world approaches to international law ideology into the project, which now, for many things that I do, just comes with me. I guess, and I hope that my classes are not as mainstream as I would have wanted, as they were before. I hope that if my students were to speak about my class, they'll not say it's a mainstream class, especially international law. They'll at least say it's a radical sort of, or a critical based class, intentionally so. But one of our great mentors called Anthony Angi has this advice on this matter. He says that for you to be a good critical lawyer, you have to be a very good mainstream lawyer. So, because you cannot critique that which you do not have deep understanding of. So in a sense, we have to understand in this project, carceralities of international law so well, because we understand how pernicious mainstream international law is and has been. So when I wrote the chapter, which is on the inequalities of sovereign equality, which is in itself, I would say, an oxymoron, Yeah, and I just realized recently that there's a whole body of work on oxymoron in law and in international law. Oxymorons, and people have written whole books on it, and I was surprised. So you might want to check into that. But my main argument in the chapter was that the sovereignty doctrine itself is a site in the language and grammar of this project of carceralities. That the sovereignty doctrine of international law is not this neutral, singular idea, which every time a state is challenged, they say we're doing that because we're a sovereign state. It's not a neutral ideology. In any case, it is just imbued with layers of material inequalities. And because of time, let me just tell you the part of the chapter that I myself enjoyed the most. While doing research, I met this scholar called Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who coined this idea of racial grammar. And the idea of racial grammar is that racial domination necessitates something like a racial grammar. That's what he says. That is, racial grammar is used to normalize the standards of white supremacy as standards for all sorts of everyday interactions that then render racial domination almost invisible, or something that is just obvious, or something that in a sense doesn't even exist. I found this very striking because in our part of the world, especially here in Kenya, when you speak of racism, people sometimes think that it's an idea that doesn't exist. This is an idea that exists in South Africa, in the US, and here we are only dealing with other questions like ethnic divisions and things of that kind. But race is not an issue here. Race is an issue in the US. Race is an issue outside. And with a few students who we do some readings with, we met the works of Jemima Pierre, which I'd met when I was doing this work, and she does work on Ghana. She's an anthropologist on race. And just like Ghana, she actually began her research by noting that in Ghana, every time she was speaking about race, people will tell her, doesn't exist here. It is not something that we see here. And it's not strange because in our societies, like here in Kenya, we think that race is this idea of discriminating people because of the color of their skin. But once you start peeling the layer just a bit, you will start seeing layers, I will say, of racialization in the way our housing is structured, in the way our economy is structured, in the way our laws are structured, in the way our ways of life are structured one or the other. So today's racial grammar operate overtly for me, especially in international law, with use of other languages. And this, I will say, are sites of carcerality. For example, the demarcation between developed and underdevelopment. The grammar of development is a strong site of carceralities. The idea of good governance and what is a good governance project is another site of carcerality. The idea of state failure, or that some African states are failed state, is a strong site of carcerality and racialization. And the next one is the one that I really love, ease of doing business. Ease of doing business is an idea that comes from the World Bank, and they have done a ranking that fell into serious disrepute because some individuals in the World Bank itself were cooking the numbers so that some countries could go higher in the ranking. And then the ease of doing business was closed by the World Bank, and now they have reintroduced it with another name. That's how I think the colonial, I would say colonial continuities operate, racialization in international law operates, and carceralities work. Okay, but these are just examples. Others are, there are many, by the way. Rule of law is another one. Corruption and all kinds of rankings that deal with corruptions are another one, or are examples of sites of carceralities. Because of time, let me just finish with two favorite examples. I know Claire had said that I would really love the example of sovereign debt. I don't even want to talk about it because if I start talking about it, I won't stop. I'll talk about, the inequality that surrounds sovereign debt is so pernicious that once I start talking about it, I'll get carried away. But I'm happy that it was raised on this floor and not from me. Institutionally, I think the idea of a veto power in the UN is a great site of carcerality institutionally, and because I'm talking about states. The weighted voting system and the way the World Bank and the IMF operate institutionally, I'm not even saying the conditionalities and the things that they do, the institutional structure of the IMF. And if anyone here doesn't know this, I say it quite a bit. the WTO has a one member, one vote system. The IMF, the World Bank, and most of this international financial institution have a weighted system voting. So it depends with the amount of money you put into the system, determines the weight of vote that you're going to have, and that determines what you can possibly vote for. So basically the IMF with 16% of US vote is always going to, the US is always going to have a very strong voice in the system. And I guess I had Raghavi mention this. Places of carceralities are, avenues of carceralities are avenues of erasure, and therefore people do not have enough voice. And if you do not have enough voice, then you end up not being able to put your concerns on the table. And the World Bank and IMF are a very good example. So I say that these are the inscriptions, that's the term I use, of racial grammar institutionally. If I had gotten an opportunity, and I think this is a beautiful project to think about it, there are many places I could say have other inscriptions of racial grammar that I didn't even touch on here that are linked to carceralities. Currently, and we were speaking about the green colonialism that is taking place in most of our world, and the carbon marketing and trading system is another place where there's a lot of carceralities that I see. Therefore, I concluded in this paper that what then we have is an abstract form of liberalism that has continued to constitute and reconstitute practices that actively create an imperial racial rule, which has a devastating effect for the most vulnerable peoples in society, and most of them live in the global south. Let me stop there. I could say a lot about this. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Harrison. That was so clear and really, really effective. Do we have any questions for him? I just realized I've held him hostage here, but do we have any questions for Harrison based on his presentation or based on questions that came up in your discussions already, which we will unpack more in the session we have just after? I see Elvis has raised his hand. Let's start.
Yeah, thanks so much. And maybe this is not just to Harrison, but to also just really everyone. I'm wondering whether we are now calling carcerality all forms of oppression. So my question here is there a core normative content of what carcerality means? Or is it, someone reads Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of Oppression, like, yes, this is carcerality, and then they will go read W. Du Bois's Black Souls, and again, this is carcerality. So does it pervade all forms of oppression, or is there a normative core content? Yeah, that's my question.
I see Raghavi is pointing to me. I will have pointed to Claire. but to say, at least the way I understand it, that carceralities are one side of oppression. There can be very many sides of oppression and very many, and because it's a side of oppression, it has very many dimensions. I would even say that the idea that closely comes to mind here is Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, that a site of carcerality, just from the way I've understood it in international law, is a site which is in itself a site of oppression, but can be a site of multiple oppression. Content-wise, I think then it can be multifaceted. It can have a lot of content in it. But also, does it really matter? Yeah, I ask myself, does it really matter to do this normative work now that we know that this is just one of the sides of oppression and there can be more? Is it replacing the notion of oppression? Possibly. Is it, expanding the notion of oppression? I will say yes to that too. In any case, I think that if we all understand that it can be multifaceted and therefore can have numerous normative content, I find that to be okay. I also answer this question as a twailer. When we are told to say what is our normative content in twail, our answer is everything. We are feminists at the same time, decolonial feminists. We have Marxists. We have feminist Marxists. It is a site that invites very many kinds of oppression, and we discuss all of it. Yeah.
Claire, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think it's a really apt question. And I guess my answer is somewhat reflects Harrison's, in that I think that when I think of carcerality, I come back to a site of containment, right? And so what that containment means is different in different contexts. So the interrelationship between the warehousing for low-paid workers in Asia is directly, is a form of, is a type of containment that it is directly associated to what Harrison was saying, which was, these things are multifaceted and multi-sided. And so for me, in my mind, and how that attaches is part of the question that I guess we're trying to figure out. So when we, in the group work, when we said how is this working, right? All of these things are interrelated, but I come back to the specific forms of containment beyond the prison, and how then that attaches to issues of gender and race and class and racial capitalism.
If I can just add there, I think when we speak about carcerality, in distinction from, say, oppression, something that stands out to me, two aspects of carcerality that I find quite valuable are, A, it's not just containment, it's containment that can operate from the internal as well as the external. Usually, when you speak about, you use the lens of oppression, it is often seen purely as an external imposition of a structure, or an external imposition of violence, or a grammar that you don't know. But I think when you start to think about carcerality, you recognize that sometimes it is also an internalized statecraft or Eurocentrism. You can contain yourself without knowing as well, right? Like it's an unwitted kind of containing yourself in a category created by someone else. So I think carcerality has that effect. And I see Humphrey's hand. And maybe just one other thing about carcerality is that it also kind of illuminates the web of carcerality outside of your immediate proximity. I think carcerality perhaps allows us to see connections, as Claire was saying, between political prisoners and the BDS and universities and this room right now, or my sort of nuclear family structure. I find that carcerality sort of flows through all of these different, it's multiscalar, which I think is quite helpful in terms of how it helps us uncover what are these systems we're really pushing back against. I think those would be a couple of things that come to my mind when I think about carcerality. Humphrey?
Yeah, thanks, Raghavi. I think the same kind of idea clicked in your mind at the same time as mine. I'll just piggyback on your description, but give two examples. I understand carcerality as a containment of thought, as a signaling, as opposed to oppression, where there's a clear line almost. And in a sense, oppression then contains thought, so that we want to see the world within established categories. That person oppresses me, that system oppresses that, and not as a web of social relations from the grassroots to the international. The first example is I would give to the whole group is what we were discussing at lunch. This experience I had, probably one of the most structurally violent, but very mundane example I saw in a court case. I was doing judicial attachment supervision. This young man, 22, 23, has been rounded up by the Pharmacy and Poisons Board and is being asked by the magistrate through so the magistrate speaks in English, the clerk speaks in Swahili, and he's being asked, what do you plead? And he's trying to say, I was just rounded up. I was not even part of this issue. So no, what do you plead? So, no, I was just rounded up. Like I was no part. What unakubali mashtaka ama unakataa? In Swahili means, do you accept the accusation or not? It's not even, are you guilty or not? And then he says no. And then he's remanded in prison, in industrial area prison for 3 months. Because he said no. And you could see, so that's what I mean, like, why am I giving this example? It's a carcerality because this moment of pleading guilty or not is put up as this moment of justice. This is when the state allows you to explain yourself. But how it is experienced in the magistrate's court is that it is the moment of ultimate injustice, a carcerality of thought from the state couldn't possibly imagine, the judicial system couldn't possibly imagine that demanding somebody to plead guilty or not, and then either being fined or being sent to remand for 3 months is an incredible injustice. So this containment of thought that justice can only come if I perform this, this is due process. And so for a fair trial, it must last long. I must give you a chance to mount a defense in industrial area prison. As I was explaining, industrial area prison is far worse than the remand prison in Nairobi is far worse than many other prisons in the country. So this for me is a moment of carcerality, because then the state can't possibly, its thought is imprisoned in this idea that justice can only be performed in this manner. That was a very more detailed, just a quick example of a second one, which I've always found fascinating. The Inter-American system, human rights system, so the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights and then later the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, had never bothered to deal with the problem of the struggles, the plight of indigenous peoples in the Americas. That was being handled by another system in the Americas that grew out of another form, then was sucked into the Organization of American States. It was called the American Indian Conferences. To the point that what I find fascinating is that the human rights system never thought that the plight of the indigenous people was a human rights question. They had to be prompted by the UN system to begin to look into the question. Again, like there's an imprisonment of thought once you have decided that this is how human rights is performed, to the point that you cannot even see how other areas, how other experiences of, and I think the other way to think about it is Harrison's view of that side, development, that you must want development. If you don't want your kids to go to boarding school, then there's something wrong with you. So, boarding school so that they can speak good English. That imprisonment of thought, with an accent. So, and then how that then permeates into the systems that we now create for providing education, which is supposed to be good. So when a community comes and says, we don't want our boys or girls to go to school, then you think, you must be backward. We'll bring you development, whether you want it or not. So I think that's a sense of, and so it allows us to see carceralities as it's this multifaceted space of understanding imprisonment of thought that, yes, causes oppression, but there's no one way. We could be many ways our oppressors in self-righteous discourses.
Thank you, Humphrey. That was super helpful. Let's continue this round of applause to thank Harrison for giving us his time and speaking to us about his chapter. I guess this takes us to the final session, which is going to be a series of presentations. Okay, 2 to 3 minutes. Each group will come back to us and share what they what their discussions were. I have a tentative, I think, list of sort of rapporteurs or presenters, just to allow me to identify the groups. Okay, and for those of you who are online, who have really patiently sort of stuck along with us online, thank you. And I know that Claire had shared the prompt, the link to the prompts with you, and also the questions. So please feel free to use the chat box to kind of share your thoughts as well. And Claire and I can sort of pick up on some comments online and, facilitate a hybrid room as much as we can. But what yeah, does Claire, does sound good?
We will try.
Perfect. Yes, we'll try. That's our promise. And I guess this is really Claire's chance to see many of you. So let's utilize that fully. So I have a list of names. Let's start with Betty. Is it from your group? Betty? Betsy, I was told as I went group to group that this is also a form of carcerality because, like, someone's being forcibly selected to present. So I recognize how carcerality was working in this room. And I also recognize how various people skirted my carceral eye and escaped the role of presenters. So well done. Let's start with group one, though. Betsy, are you ready? No, it's okay. It's absolutely fine. This is a safe space. Yeah, 2 to 3 minutes, super casual. Just come up and tell us what prompt you chose and how your group kind of reflected on the 3 questions. Group exercise, excellent.
Okay, so Betty. So the first question is just to identify the forms of carcerality.
So we did question 1 on the Nuremberg trials. Yeah. Yeah. So okay, so we did question 1 on the Nuremberg trials. And so I think the first question, or at least what we're supposed to look through in these seminar questions, was kind of the forms of carcerality that manifest through these questions, right? So I think largely the Nuremberg trials showcase the complexity of carcerality in its entirety, right? Because I think it's a kind of duplicity, because again, the Nazis were not necessarily innocent in their actions. So particularly with the Nuremberg trials, so there's victor justice essentially. So see the Allied powers kind of choosing who did the greater evil, I think. So history is written by the victors, right? So yeah, I would say that was essentially the first element of carcerality and kind of how it also, just in considering the Axis powers was not necessarily just Germany, just Nazi Germany, right? So the Japanese did have their own trials, but again, we see Mussolini and the Italians and fascist Italy never really did have trials. So there's that element of carcerality. And okay, so the second question largely was now the categories. So the trials in themselves was kind of form
a type of, maybe Nabintu can also just expand on this more because she came up with this during the discussion. So the trials themselves as a category or like a centerpiece, right, for carcerality, right? Maybe.
Okay, so the idea of having the trials themselves, okay, we were like I think they had many options before coming up with the trials themselves. Like in our minds, that's what was like going on, because when we see the categories, we see mainly the modes of administering justice. So trials themselves cannot be like a formal, let's say, court or all that cannot be the only solution. Especially when you see, let's say, Kenya is coming up with the idea of AJS. People in their community can just sit and decide on like who is right, who is wrong, but in a more sophisticated, like different way, like at a community level, they just come with their own like ideas. But when we see the Nuremberg trial itself, it comes with this idea of individual criminal like responsibility. And when we have the like individual, let's say for example, we sit down and come with this idea of capitalism, like yes, capitalism. And in that idea, let's say I ended up killing Beastie. Yes, I'll go to prison, but what about the ideology, the idea itself on the other side? Then there is this idea of mens rea and actus reus. So the idea is there a way we could just rethink it in terms of state crime? Does a state as a mind? Does like a state like in those like, yeah, I think that was like the ideas with us. And apart from that, we have also scientific immunities, like some people were given immunities and not the others. So there's this kind of like, how do you choose who got immunity and who does not? And here we see some scientifics who are important, especially for the US, in coming up with bombs, coming up with military like innovations, if I could say, like in military innovations and open air moon and so on. So that, I think that was our idea. Then how to rethink them. I think we've mentioned like in between, yeah. Yes.
Excellent. Fantastic points, actually. Claire, what do you think? About state crime, about what was happening in Japan, race, capitalism, looking at immunity, looking at structures and how individual categories of mens rea don't capture these structures of carcerality. Thought really, really excellent points by this group. Shall we move to the next one? I just have a list of names here, and you guys can pick and choose who wants to come. These are just identifying names for me for each group. I'm looking at you, James. Would you like to come up also to the podium? And as each group hears the comments of previous groups, do try and sort of draw links, yeah?
Okay.
Okay. So the prompt that we picked was algorithmic military violence. So the case study was based on two AI prompt models, and one of them refused to actualize autonomous use of AI weapons in the military. And the other one came and said it would take the position, or it will take the place of the one that had refused. So one of the carceralities that we identified was the means and methods of war, or war in general. So in this instance, you see
the definitive stakes that are within are that the autonomy of weapons has the use of weapons has no longer been self-actualizing. So you have things like AI that can actualize military use, but from remote places. So autonomous weapons in general, or lethal autonomous weapons laws, they usually tend to like use different models of models of communication, and they are usually deployed from a peripheral or a different place that is not usually located central to where somebody is. So some of the things that that came up when we were discussing on the autonomous use of weapons was what are the conditions or what are the effects of that centrality or that centrality of that's currently ongoing. So you get on regarding the autonomous use of weapons. First of all, if you have weapons that don't get tired, or you have weapons that can be deployed from any particular region, you won't see the need to have human beings going into the front line, because the reason why wars usually people usually don't do wars that much, because they fear that people will die, and the usually economic costs involved with the war itself. So if you have autonomous weapons, then what's stopping you from deploying, let's say, a gadget, or they are usually called switchblades? You deploy it, then it goes and, let's say, bombs a place, and you are just seated comfortably. So it will be really easy to like deploy or use military warfare if you had autonomous weapons. Now, the second point is that if you are currently carrying out scientific research in the academia, or you're an academia and you're carrying out scientific research, the research will be co-opted. Yeah, so the research will be co-opted into the use and the model of the AI that will go into like creating the autonomous weapons. So you get the non-scientific research, and the scientific research will be used to test and to run. And most of the times, the military people aren't that they aren't they don't tend to like use the knowledge that much. So like they just carry out the war. They'll need people in academia to like tell them this is what's supposed to be done and this is what's supposed to be done. So you get, if you are an academia, your research work will be used regardless of whether you consent or not. Then the third option is, if you continuously keep using the weapons and it's a certain type of region or a certain type of place, you'll usually get places that will tend to deflect blame. So you get a state has used the military weapons and it has ended up deflecting blame and said, the weapons that I've used them, but it's not my cause of action that has happened, or I didn't use them, but in the sense they used them, but they just say that they didn't do so. So you get, they deflect, they tend to deflect the cause or the action that have been taken by them in general. Then what legal categories have been used to impose serality? I'd say regulation of AI, because in this instance we're still talking about regulation of AI, and we're still talking about the ethics that go about with the use of AI. But at times you get the centrality of ethics isn't that poised to what you as a person believe is ethic use of AI and what another person believe is ethic use of AI. So an example is some research facilities are using AI to test or to mutate viruses. So you get viruses are being subject to mutation. So a certain AI is prompted, then they tend to play around with viruses and they tend to see how they'll behave. So somebody will argue perhaps that's innovative research, but what would happen if that virus escaped, or those viruses escaped? And it's usually really differentiated because they have the facilities to do so and certain places don't have the facilities to do so. Then imagine international law in this situation that doesn't have centrality. So it's really difficult to imagine international law if this centrality doesn't exist, because it's a modernized based, sociological based serality, which is war. So you can't do away with war, because with conflicts and with ardent resources, conflicts will arise every day. And people usually tend to fight for resources because of development aspects. So you get, in this issue, if you were to imagine international law, in this situation that doesn't have seriality, it will be perhaps to find a way to perhaps revolution has already defined our way of thinking of autonomous weapons so that they can better suit our needs as, let's say, Africans. But that's going to be deeper than what has been envisioned in the long run. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. So many big ideas. My God. We can't have international law without war. Wars are fought for, resources. Neoliberal universities are co-opting. They're all complicit in this, military violence. Oh my God, big ideas, big ideas. It would have taken people ages to say the number of things you said in 4 minutes. So well done. I next have on my list Victor. I see no Victor in the room. Okay, let's move on to the next person. Felix. Yes. Also really great that all of you are sort of dealing with different prompts. I think it allows us to see the connections. Like we were speaking about Nuremberg, right? We were speaking about state structures and military violence. And you look at this algorithmic prompt, and you're suddenly thinking about not just the state, but like people like me and you, right? Like who are in a university setup. And from our very local positions also, we are contributing to very multi-scalar carceralities.
Okay, may it please us all. Our group chose the topic, which is our activities carceral cis. Yeah, and in navigating this activity, okay, in navigating this activity, a problem arises where a fishing boat attempting to travel from Libya to Italy, carrying migrants, capsizes in the Mediterranean, and this ship is carrying majority people on board are women and children, and now there is in a ship there is the place that carries cargo, which is called the hold, and the place that carries or the place called deck, which carries or ferries human beings. And the place or the hold which carries cargo has a large number of people, we can say, pumped into it. And these people can't be rescued when the ship capsizes, because the water is entering through the hold. So the people that can be rescued are those ones that are on the deck. Now, what does this imply? A reflection by our group brings an implication of financial, if I may say, carcerality, whereby you're discriminated based on or you have to die based on your financial capability. Those ones who paid more, because those ones who are on the deck paid more, and those ones who are in the hold paid less. The second part, now, before I move to the second part, this ship is coming from Libya. Does it crack your brain that because these people are Africans, then could be a colossal cause why this could have happened to them? A question I put to us. Now, the second part of the question is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, Italy and Malta declared their ports unsafe and refused entry to migrant rescue vessels, leaving hundreds stranded at sea or transferred to offshore quarantine ships. is that carcerality whereby you are transferred to offshore an offshore quarantine ship, or you can't be rescued because of a pandemic? But if you look at section 90 or article 96 of the UNCLOS, which provides that during rescue or when a ship is in the process of rescue, it must be allowed to do so. So is that carcerality? And the last part of our problem question was that the European cooperation with the Libyan Coast Guard has also enabled, and this looks like a policy, because if you're cooperating on, sorry, let me just finish up the question, that European Union cooperation in cooperation with the Libyan Coast Guard has also enabled the interception and forced return of migrants to detention centers in Libya, while humanitarian rescue vessels have been delayed, impounded, or criminalized. If you look at this problem, is the European Union cooperating, or is that a policy that I would say propagates carcerality? Sorry, is that a policy that perpetuates carcerality? In my view, it does, because a further scrutiny of the International Convention for Safety of Life will direct you to the fact that when, and that is as Article 5, that contracting governments to that we'll call treaty should allow their vessels to move with speed to say rescue persons who are in imminent danger. So if you're entering into a cooperation to ensure that your ship or the vessels be delayed or impounded, or criminalizing ships that are bringing or are going to help people who have been held up in such dilapidated conditions, does that then raise the question of carcerality? In my view, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Claire, thoughts on this presentation?
So for me, it kind of comes back to the question that was posed before, which is, are we now just replacing all sorts of oppressions with this idea of carceralities, and highlights the challenges of, in this case, a literal kind of understanding of various forms of bordering practices, which themselves require this physical containment, with other forms of oppressions, other forms of how it works. You've got your international law, you've got your policies. So kind of the messiness of all of these things, and then how they act on people to contain us in various ways, right? And I feel like that presentation really problematized that really well.
Yeah, well done, well done. Is there any other group that also looked at the carceral seas example? Perhaps it will give us a chance to look at back-to-back kind of thoughts. Yes, yours? Come on up. Are you Melissa? Great.
Good afternoon. So the other group has highlighted like everything that we had also covered. Yeah, it's just that they didn't highlight the legal standing that we also looked at. But they mentioned Article 98 of the UNCLOS, which place safety of rescued persons, of which these casualties did not look at. For instance, when the EU cooperation and the Libyan Coast Guard had pushed back the refugees that had come into their humanitarian rescue. And also they didn't state Article 12 of the ICESCA, which allows disease control, but also must protect human rights in Article D when states must come up with policies. This was, we looked at during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, when Italy and Malta declared their ports unsafe and refused entry to migrant rescue vessels. Yeah.
Thank you. This was super helpful. But I think listening to both presentations, a question that we would like all of you to sit with is, sure, we have international legal rules, okay, international legal rules that that sort of enjoin obligations of non-refoulement or obligations of safe passage, right? We have these obligations in law, but I guess something for us to think about is, who are those obligations created for? Like, who was in mind when these obligations were created, right? So let's go back to the UNCLOS, right, which your group mentioned. Think about when there were conversations being had about safe passage and migrants traveling by sea. Who are these? Who did they see within the figure of the migrant? Who did they see as someone who would threaten safe passage, right? Like, what were the identity categories, the racialized, imperial kind of notions that were attached to these provisions, which you will not see on text, but you will see this in the subtext, right? Or you will see this in the way it's played out in practice, as we showed you in the prompt, right? So it's not like the UNCLOS was created as a completely kind of neutral provision. It was created knowing that certain people or certain bodies, certain kind of racialized bodies are perhaps more of a threat than others are, right? That's what allows the provision to be used like that. So really what we are trying to get you to think about is, look at the mind working behind the text, right? The thought, containment of thought. Those are the ideas that we are looking for you all to sort of focus on. So well done. Now I have a couple more names. I have Eugene's name on this list. Is Eugene around? Great.
Good evening, everyone. We were looking at prompt number 2 on the Hague regulations, or rather the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction. So our discussion was majorly around the idea that Mr. Sipala was discussing, that there is a certain point of view that is considered to be justice. But in the real sense, when we really interrogate it, it's the contrary. And this is in light of ignoring certain circumstances. So according to the Hague Convention, or rather this specific one, the priority is the swift return of the child to the state of residence when they are moved without the consent of the other parent. So I deeply resonated with Mr. Sipala's analogy on remandees and the specific story of the guy that I was just picked up, and how they did not consider the specific circumstances in which he found himself in that situation. So then, while we were discussing and purely working out of the facts that are provided in the prompt, we realized that when the prioritization of the return is expressed in the treaty, it ignores circumstances such as a mother fleeing with a child from domestic violence. And this brings into question the conversation around carcerality, so that we understand this this prioritization of the return in light of what motivated the the creation of the convention. And the facts that we were working with highlighted that the convention was informed by the apprehension of European majority negotiating states of fathers abducting children to North African countries. So then we get to see that this view is imposed to the rest of the world just because a few European states were insecure about European fathers taking children to North Africa. So then that whole understanding culminated to the reasoning that were it to be different, then it would put into consideration the aspect of jurisdiction of the courts, more especially in the receiving end of the conversation, so that the court can be allowed to interrogate the specific circumstances in which a mother, say, escaping domestic violence, like really understand why a child is not in their habitual country of residence. So in a jiffy, that is what we discussed. And it is always a challenge to speak at this point of the conversation, but I'm happy to share what we found.
Excellent. You're saying it was a challenge for you to speak, but really, it was so clear. I was listening to you like I was listening to an expert, like legal scholar speaking. Really, so excellent, excellent structure, so effective. Yeah, you explained things so simply and easily. Wonderful, well done. You're speaking about, you know, the convention kind of offers the illusion that it is freeing the child, right? It's freeing the child from a case of an abusive situation or from a possible abduction. But really what it is doing is it is containing mothers fleeing domestic violence. It is containing sort of who the convention puts within the box of, racialized people, who it puts within the box of potential criminals, right? Like potential people who would abduct their children, right? It's presented as a convention that frees, but it is really a convention that curtails, right? And it uses categories of race, categories of who's fit to be a mother, who is not fit to be a mother. So motherhood, gender, you can really see how these sort of conjunctive identities come into play when international law wants to be carceral, like it does here. Yeah, I see a question.
Okay, so I have to confess these ideas are not mine. Okay, there's also the question of time, in a sense where when you give that idea of freeing the child, you do not, it's like you are separating the child from one parent. You do not tell the child for how long will you be, like, will this situation take? Am I going to see again my father or my mother from like on the other side? Yeah.
Excellent point. Can I just add here? So if you look at the drafting of the convention, right? This is a convention that exceptionally does not make best interests of the child. So welfare of the child, one of the reasons why, one of the limitations, one of the exceptions. And the reason they didn't do that was because they had such a fear that children would be abducted to North African countries. And they feared that that abduction and allowing for best interests would create a pathway for the traditional kind of Islamic laws of those countries to become the ruling laws, using which interests of the child are determined, right? So there was that kind of fear also that motivated the way that the convention was designed to make sure that, what is actually a foundation. If you look at any child rights convention, they will always say, look at the best interests of the child, right? Look at the welfare of the child. But this convention deliberately avoided that so that it could avoid what it thought was a kind of unfit legal system having a say in the way the decision was made. Humphrey, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, wow, that's a different, like it was also the legitimizing, like you couldn't possibly, justice couldn't possibly come from an Islamic system in North Africa. Okay. Yeah, I just thought, but also the point that Eugene was making, that then law in itself operates to imprison an idea and spread it to all of us. So now, years later, we are They made a law for themselves, and then now it's all our law. This is also true of the Refugee Convention. The Refugee Convention was supposed to expire in 1967. It was really to resolve the refugee crisis that arose in Europe for the from the wars, right? From their own tribal wars that they had from 1939 to 45. It had nothing to do with the rest of the world. The treaty was very clear about that. And they had to pass a protocol in 1967 to release the treaty from time and space considerations. And so they said, yeah, it will now apply to any state that wishes to ratify it indefinitely. But it was really just supposed to be for Europe until the mid 60s. And that might, by the way, might explain to you why there is a 1969 African Convention on specific aspects of the refugee problem in Africa, because Africa was saying, when you did this, we were not there. But yes, this law, which Eugene was saying, it also binds us, and we were not part of it.
Thank you. Can we move to one more group? Can we hear from Moturi now? Why is everyone laughing? I seem to have touched the femur bone. Is that the funny one?
Yeah, good evening. So today being a Friday, I'm going to be very brief because my colleague James has almost exhausted what we had in mind. So we took prompt 5, rhythmic military violence. So, and I'll begin by saying that international humanitarian law and international criminal law provide international customary principles that govern warfare. We have the principle of distinction, proportionality, and precautions. But when we bring the concept algorithmic military violence, then you will see that it violates these principles. So the question is, and we have our African lead machetes during war being prosecuted. I have not seen anyone who has used algorithmic military violence being prosecuted. So how does a carcerality seen in this particular prompt? We have the state capacity against corporations. So in this particular case, we see that the United States uses Anthropic's artificial intelligence model, and it forces it to comply, and it does away with its red line. It takes away the ethical considerations. And when we talk about ethical consideration, it makes the artificial intelligence system to be fully autonomous. So that means it doesn't need the human aspects when it is being used. And in this particular case, this can be evident in just the ongoing war between the United States and Iran, where we see that a school was bombed. This is one of the effects when we use AI attacks without subjecting them to human approval. We also see that these corporations are subjected to sanctions if they don't comply to the state forces demands. The sanctions are applied against them. They are blacklisted. And that is why we see that OpenAI in this particular case offers an alternative. It says that it can comply so that it can work with the United States government. So this shows that the issue of economics also play at hand. We have private corporations that are willing to compromise ethical consideration and principles of international criminal law and humanitarian law for economic interests. So that defeats the entire purpose of humanizing war. So, and also decision making. When an AI system is conditioned in a way to make decisions without relying on human assistance, Then the issue of liability, who is attributable to the effects of the war? Is it these private corporations or is it the states? That is why it becomes difficult to prosecute states based on AI systems that are being deployed. Yeah, and I think now my colleague will proceed to address the last question. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Aston. Margaret, Bilha, and I will deal with the final question on which, as a group, we were supposed to imagine how international law will look like if maybe things were different. And in this case, we are looking at the AI model if it was not incorporated in warfare. So what we thought as our group, we have two alternatives on how international law will look like. So the first suggestion is to do away with AI models completely when it comes to warfare. Reason being, when we were discussing, we had an example of if like during Mau Mau in Kenya, if AI models were there by then. You see, during the Mau Mau guerrilla warfare, I will say, people were going to fight, they come back to their families. So if AI could dictate those people where they are living, it will lead to like the principle that he has talked about, distinction of combats and individuals. So it will have led to a really big tragedy. So that's why that's one of the reasons why we see it best that AI model, when it comes to matters warfare, should be done away with completely. And also it will bring about the concept that Huston talked about full human control, because as we talked about in our group, AI models make mistakes. So they won't know these are individuals or combats in a warfare. So that's why we suggested that. And also the second alternative was we have an AI non-proliferation treaty. This will regulate this will come in instead of banning like the AI model entirely. It will bring some regulations of which it's difficult as a group. We saw it, yeah, that way. It will be really difficult because AI is programmed. So yeah, so those are the two suggestions that we had. Thank you so much.
Claire, did you hear that? They basically said we should have an AI non-proliferation treaty.
I know, and but again, like, yes, so hard. Do we have anyone else, or is that the last?
I think so. On my list, I also have Festus. Hello, I see you there, right? I took note of you when you entered the room. I knew I had to call on you.
So good evening, good morning, good afternoon from whichever part of the world you are joining us from. So my group will be handling the third prompt, that is the Italy's United Heritage Task Force, which is being referred to as the Blue Helmets for Culture. And we'll be answering the three questions, that is the form of carcerality and how the carcerality has manifested itself, and the third prompt on what are the alternatives that we can take. So with regard to the first question on the form of carcerality, so the form of carcerality that we as a group have identified is the militarization and securitization of the cultural heritage. In that, instead of treating this cultural preservation as a civilian or an academic or a community-based effort, the approach that has been taken reframes it as a security issue that is requiring armed intervention. And from the prompt, we can identify some of the terms that have been used to show the carcerality. And the first term that has been used there is paramilitary task force. And basically this means the military bringing sort of an army which brings some sort of military discipline and tactics to all sorts of heritage works. And we can also see the second term, which is the military policing force. And this has basically merged military powers with police authority. And another term that shows a form of carcerality is the use of Italian police forces, that is to protect heritage works in Syria. With regards to the second question, how carcerality was happening, or rather how carcerality was manifesting itself, so the carcerality was basically manifesting itself through international intervention measures, and that is through the UNESCO. And how we were able to break it down is basically, it was manifesting itself in two aspects. First, what we have regarded as the hard security approach. The security protocols, that is, the task force was mobilized in conflicts abroad based on determinations of breach of peace by the United Nations Security Council. And the second form in which the carcerality manifested itself is through the expansion of this policing power that is now post-2022, whereby the change was made so that the task force now only requires invitation of UNESCO to be activated. And now to my last prompt, that is on the alternative that can be taken. We have suggested a solution of moving away from this top-down policing criteria, and we have suggested the first community-based stewardship. And basically, this is where we invest our resources and we redirect them towards empowering local communities who live near the cultural heritage sites to protect and manage their own heritage. And the second solution that we suggest as a group is basically civilian cooperation, in that we can rely on civil society organizations for restoration and protection of our cultural heritage works. And the last suggestion that we provide is basically using these diplomatic frameworks to strengthen international laws against trafficking of these antiquities and using diplomatic pressure to protect these cultural heritage sites. And that was our presentation, and thank you for your time.
All right, thank you. I wish you guys could see the private exchanges Claire and I are having, where we're just saying, oh my God, this is a brilliant intervention. How did they crack this so easily? We're just saying this to each other, all text. But really, this was excellent. You summarized actually what are really complicated kind of carceral links between heritage, the UNESCO, which is seen as a kind of soft law body, right? Why was the UNESCO created? It was created for supposedly for education and peace building after the Second World War, and suddenly the UNESCO has now become a space where highly otherwise scrutinized security decisions to intervene in a country are taken with very little check, right? Like with very little accountability. It's effectively a way for a country to have a military outpost somewhere, but say, oh, we are doing this for the sake of heritage protection, right? Which is a super insidious kind of carceral apparatus that kicks in purely through the language of heritage, which everyone thinks is a good language. It's good to protect heritage. So it becomes so difficult to question, right? So well done. You summarize these. I think all of you, you all dealt with such complex kind of forces that are at work. It would have taken people otherwise years to unpack these things with to in the same level of ease with which you guys did it right now. So give yourself a big round of applause, I'd say. Um, well done. I think through the course of the prompts, we've looked at various categories, right? Gender, the non-state, the internet, the seas. We've looked at criminality and, criminal justice, whether it's justice or just a continuation of a penal regime. We've looked at race, we've looked at religion, we've looked at motherhood, we've looked at heritage, right? Really, what you see here is a snapshot. We've looked at health. One of the prompts also had reference to the COVID pandemic, right? What you see here in this very small kind of snapshot is really a very small component of how vast the carceral web really is, right? Claire, do you have any closing thoughts? What should we kind of leave this group with?
I think it honestly is just a profound sense of thanks. Thank you for taking it seriously. Thank you for participating. Also, thank you for getting up and presenting your ideas, because that's never easy. And I'm so impressed with everyone. And so, yeah, just thank you.
Yes. Big thank you from us. I guess in terms of where we go from here, right? So like we said at the very start, this is a super fresh preliminary idea that we are currently workshopping. And we want to turn this into a longer, sustained conversation, especially with students, right? We want to co-produce with students. And we want us all to together reflect on what are the ways in which we experience carceral international law. But like you were doing, like you guys were asking such brave questions right now, right? Someone said, hey, let's have an AI non-proliferation treaty. Hey, let's rebuild, let's do heritage protection, co-produce heritage protection locally, right? Like these are radical ideas. We just want to create a space where we can constantly have such conversations about these radical ideas, right? So I'd say in terms of next steps, the first thing would be we've been taking notes, Claire and I, of today's session, and we'd like to sort of extend the conversation, right? Make it a continuous thing. You're going to encounter various, I mean, knowing that you're taught by Humphrey, who is really like this encyclopedia of all kinds of historical events. Any call that Claire and I have with Humphrey, we go back realizing we know so little. He knows so much about all parts of international law, and so you have this treasure of a resource here, and clearly that means you're exposed to, and as I can see, exposed to such radical ideas with such close proximity, which is a big privilege. And I think what we'd like to do is for us to have a more sustained conversation, right? So we're going to try and build a collective, okay, which is in some ways housed at this university, okay, and we would really like for many of you students to write to us via Humphrey or directly. Just really tell us that you're interested in this kind of intellectual exercise, okay, where we think about abolition, potentially do something about it, right? We'll figure out what is to be done later once we know, but really think together. We have more frequent kind of conversations. This was quite vast, but more localized, more kind of focused conversations on different issues of international law and how we can critique it, how we can rebuild, and what alternative futures would look like. I think for us, really, I must say, this was a kind of laboratory, right? Where we are putting out an idea and seeing how this idea can travel and what comes back, right? So for us, really, I think for Claire and I, it was super assuring, and it was so enriching to hear all of you and to learn from you. So I guess what we leave you with is, if this project is of interest, let us know if you'd like to be involved. And what we'll do is we'll set up a more kind of formal, organized structure for lots of students to partner with us, to write with us, to think with us. And hopefully this collective will have a longer life than all of us put together, right? Claire, closing words, closing thoughts?
The only thing that I would say is also, if you want to give us feedback, that would be very, very much appreciated, whether you want to give it to Raghavi in the room or if you want to give it to via Free. Also, we're very, very, very happy, given that it's such the early stage in the project, and this is the first time that we've actually been able to workshop these ideas in this environment, that if you guys have anything to say to us, genuinely, please do.
Yes, this is a good moment to do it already. Otherwise, if they're particularly harsh comments, just send them on email.
Corner Raghavi right now, which she turns the microphone off.
There's a hand. Yes.
I'm so sorry for coming this late. But for me, the question, it's a very good, very confused question. I'm confused. I thought first off that the removal of scarcity was to sorry. Yes, was to be able to deal with, the oppressions, which with what I've gotten from the conversation, you even talking about the oppression in form of power, and when you say things like the veto power and things like that, but how do you intend to deal with the naturalist way of thinking? Like, for example, even when you talk about wars, what is the goal, that it will get to a point that we'll be able to be sure that the systems that are put up, no one can go against them? Or how do we deal with the emotions of people that if a nation gets bombed today, the next thing they're thinking about is restorative justice and things like that? Or to what extent can it get to, for example, in cells, for example, how will you be able to deal with if a pedophile is brought in? How will the officers, how will this system be able to make sure that the officers will be able to be kind with them and show them ethics of care and try to fix them to bring them back into society? I feel like it will be in a little bit too, yeah, fictional, because how will we be able to cope with the anger, for example? Yes, or what are we aiming towards?
Yeah, good question. And I guess this is exactly the kind of response we want to elicit, right? Which is to say that for most of the global majority, questions of international law are not questions of theory. They are questions of everyday encounters, right? You are angry because you encounter law. You are angry because you encounter the fact that it was not created with someone like you in mind, right? Like you want to channel your emotion towards law, and that is what will clarify to you that international law is not a project that we must be distant from, but a project we must be involved in. I guess for us with this session, it was really just to start a conversation about recognizing what's wrong, right? And only with that recognition of what's wrong and knowing what are the questions we should be asking, can we sort of translate it to our everyday decision making, right? So how am I to know that, like, for example, Claire was not able to come to Kenya this time, right? This decision, this event is not an isolated event. It is an event that falls on the back of years of ways in which aviation routes are made between continental Europe and Africa, right? So now, if she was not able to come today, if that event was just for us full stop, like that she was not able to come and we weren't asking questions of what are the structures that allowed this, or what are the ways in which those structured work that allowed this, then we would not know how to respond to it in an adequate way also. So I think if something like that happens, your first response is, oh, I'm angry that I'm not able to come. Yes, channel that anger, that's good. But that anger, when it's accompanied by the right kinds of critiques of the system, knowing where the system is failing, I think would lead us to find kind of better visions. I guess something to also say here is that, at least for me personally, this is not an exercise in finding solutions. This is really not an exercise in finding one solution at all. It is in fact so many questions, come up with several solutions. Like, I think what the kind of training we are used to is to ask one question and to come up with one answer for it, a right answer. And that extinguishes possibility, right? So really what we should try and endeavor to do is to be able to ask infinite questions and hope that those infinite questions would lead to different kinds of, rebuilding, new visions, right? They may conflict, they may be hypocritical, they may be whatever, but at least there's a possibility for us to imagine that and for us to work towards that. So thank you for that intervention. And I guess we work on that now. We work on that and we figure out what connects, say, a concern about, what do we do if someone who's perpetrated sexual crimes in a room, like what do you know about what shouldn't allow them to access that space? So how do you deal with them with care when they are in that space? That's a legal decision, actually. That is a legal decision mediated by social relations. But to get to that place, we ask questions, right? So I guess this is one of those places we ask those questions. More interventions, more thoughts. All right, I see no other hands up. I guess that brings us to the end of this very long masterclass. Thank you for indulging us and for participating so generously. Give yourselves a round of applause, really. And like I said, we'll stay in touch. If we don't, pull us up. and tell us to stay in touch, because we really need to stay in touch and make sure that there are opportunities for us to work with all of you, learn from all of you, write with you, think with you. And that's really the only way this collective is going to have a life, right? So any ideas you have about what abolition could look like in your kind of areas of interest or people you work with? Are there creative hubs you work with here in Kenya or outside of Kenya? Are there social justice centers? I visited a couple of them in Nairobi this time. Are there social justice centers you work with who would be, you really want this collective to push against structures? How can the collective do that? So we really want sort of not be the only people thinking about it, think with all of you about where this can go, right? I'll close here and thank you. Yeah, I guess that's the note to end on. And let's thank Claire for being in this discombobulated form. Yep. And also everyone online. I recognize that as usual, it's always a case of online audiences not receiving enough attention, but I hope you took something marginally meaningful from this very long masterclass.
Wow, thank you guys so much. Thank you so much for coming, for engaging. It would have been, I mean, I think about like, I mean, when you try and think of this new crazy idea, and then imagine you propose it and then everybody goes like, meh. We would have had such a such a depressing afternoon. So thank you so much. I think we are taught, and this is, I think, something we should do better as teachers, because we should be brave enough to teach differently from the way we were taught, and we were taught with a certain finality. I remember, so as I keep telling you guys, I'm not a lawyer. I did my undergraduate in education, and in second year of education, there's a course called History of Education, Philosophy of Education. And I encountered a movement in pedagogical sciences called deschooling. And it essentially says that no education happens in schools, so we must abolish schools. Yes. But I mean, I remember it hitting me like, what? You are allowed to even think like this? So here we are in a school teaching the deschooling movement. But I think it's precisely this kind of thing. There are systems and procedures embedded in the practice of law. You file, civil procedure, right? You file this, you get that, right? Originating summons gives you, I don't know, you guys tell me. You know what I mean? Like there are certain, and this is also a very common law thing, right? Like whatever you file already determines what remedy you're asking. And I think the plea here is to remember that while you should learn, as Angie says, learn the system well, but don't imbibe the idea that the usefulness of one-way systems in procedures is the only way we can think about the phenomena we deal with. So you may today have, the only way is you have to go and report to a police station. Maybe that's what the procedure requires, but you could think wider, you could think more creatively. And I think every progress in human history has come from saying, this is procedure, I'm following it, but I also think widely. So, because this is always a risk, right? You want astute practitioners, but you also want them to think creatively and innovatively and critically about the phenomena. So I hope this was one of the many instances where we do this. I am most thankful for you guys coming and for this conversation. I am obviously very thankful to Associate Dean when we through the idea you jumped in, It's our kind of thing. It's also happy coincidence that again you work because so I think the question, I think Claire didn't know that you were here. It's like, no, he's actually here. Like, is he here? No, he is here. Yeah, so it was lovely because conversation started when you were coming in. You already knew each other with Raghavi and you, so this really has worked together so well. I'm most thankful. Obviously to Raghavi and Claire. Crazy ideas are started online. We talk about how we should Robin Hood certain things. So here we are in using a Zoom platform, which is not, which is in itself a carcerality, to bridge certain, so I think was it Wole Soyinka or is it Wole Soyinka? Oh. So in that debate that was happening in African literature, so what was it Wole Soyinka? Was it said Ochino Achebe said, yes, English may be a colonial language, but at least it gave us a voice to talk to each other. Yes, so these tools of techno-feudalists still allows us to have these conversations. We've had a number of them, and which has brought us here, despite the other carceralities of international law that make you not be here physically. Thank you so much, Raghavi. It's telling, I mean, just to tell you guys, so when we first started having this conversation, the thing that sold it for me was there was no doubt in Raghavi and Claire's mind that we're doing this in the global south, which wins it for me, right? There is an embedded, we all good things. Let's go to Europe for the good things, and Europe never comes. I think that's what the Madare Social Justice Center was saying. Like, I told you about, so guys in the hood say, look, stop having your democracy meetings in fancy hotels. Come and have them in where we live, in the village. So centering this here is part of the statement. Is part of the statement, and we're most thankful for that. I think conversations can and should continue. Reach out to Claire and Raghavi about any and all questions, including how do I get to SOAS? For those who want to study in SOAS, how do I get to University of Amsterdam? Go there, Robin Hood the ideas, bring them back to the global south. That's the idea. Let's use Zoom to say that. There is something small, and I will ask Associate Dean to do the honors. And I'll ask Raghavi to carry one of them for Claire. It's a little gift package for for you guys as part of as so you go with a memento of us and yeah.
Thank you. Claire, I'm receiving something on your behalf as well.
So thank you so much. Thank you. Love the end, right? Yes. Thank you so much, guys. Okay. Held you all hostage for so long.